What's going on, guys? This is Rob. If you guys enjoy my content, make sure you hit the subscribe button and make sure you hit that little bell so you never miss out on my sexy voice. Okay, so we are officially picking up with Doomsday Clock Part 4. I know it's been a little while since we've covered Doomsday Clock. It's being released like bi-monthly now, which is really disappointing because the story's so good. And like I'm always on the edge, like dude, I really want to know what happens next. But we are on Part 4. And this is the origin of like the new Rorschach. And this is kind of cool because what this is going to do is basically prove me wrong and prove a lot of people right. And I know there are those of you guys who were part of my channel who were just like, I don't care what happens as long as Rob is wrong. So like it's fine. It's not a huge deal to me. It doesn't really matter to me. But this is cool because this gives us like the origin of this new version. Now remember, playing a little bit of catch up for those of you guys who are just now jumping into things or who have forgotten. The idea is that Geoff Johns is kind of blending the DC universe with the Watchmen universe. And we didn't know who this version of Rorschach was. All we knew was that Rorschach had just popped up inside of the Doomsday Clock stories. And of course we knew it wasn't like the original Walter Korvax because he died at the end of Watchmen. And so in this, the question everybody had was, who is this new version of Rorschach? What in the world is going on here? And so what this does, and it's a little confusing at first because it actually kind of bounces back and forth because of the fact that this version of Rorschach had basically appeared in the Batcave, had made his way in there, and then ultimately was, taken by Batman and tricked into Arkham Asylum. He's basically just been residing here ever since. But what it does is it jumps back and forth between the past and the present. Now it's designed to be this way. Geoff Johns has been writing comic book stories long enough that if his intention is not to like create bewilderment, then he won't create it. And so the fact that this story is just kind of like bouncing around and almost leaving us with a state of confusion in terms of what's happening in the present, what's happening in the past, that's designed to be the nature of like the Rorschach character. His mind is quite literally a wreck. It's absolutely decimated in so many different ways. And the reason for this is because what we do is we initially pick up when he was younger. Basically, he's the son of Malcolm Long. He's the son of the psychologist that was analyzing Walter Korvax, analyzing the original Rorschach. And picking up with him, what we end up finding out is that when his father essentially took on the case of Walter, there were a lot of things that were going on in the background that, Rorschach's, we'll just call him Rorschach for the sake of it, that Rorschach's mom was really kind of in a state of like she was struggling because her husband was becoming more and more distant. And that was in the original Watchmen comic. Like that's the way that story originally went down, is that Malcolm Long became more and more separated from his family. It became an obsession. The desire to learn about Rorschach and the desire to learn what made Rorschach tick, what made the original Walter Korvax tick, that became like the drive of Malcolm Long himself, of Reggie's dad. And so because of that, it eventually drove a wedge between Reggie's mom and Reggie's father. But we didn't know the effect that it had on Reggie. And initially it didn't have a huge one. It didn't have a massive effect on him. He was just kind of watching things that were going on and he was sort of looking at these protests and so on and so forth. But all that changed in the attack on New York. When this monster was unleashed and this huge psychic backlash just swept across the city and killed 3 some odd million people, it had this massive effect on him because what it did is it drove him insane. It drove him crazy. He was one of the survivors of this whole incident. He was rescued by the cops. He was taken to an insane asylum, and that was really about it. He was just kind of left there. In fact, he was taken to the same institution that Mothman was taken to in the Watchmen comics, or before the Watchmen comics started. And so while the two of them are occupying a cell, what we end up having is this guy, Dr. Matthew Mason, who shows up. And this is kind of cool because what Geoff Johns does is he puts on this kind of show that like the cycle repeats itself, that Walter Korvax basically becomes a vigilante. He goes crazy. He ends up getting caught. He ends up being thrown into an institution. And then you end up having like Malcolm Long who shows up, and Malcolm Long interviews him, and then Malcolm Long starts to become the new Rorschach, and that drives a wedge in his family. This cycle repeats itself here. Of course, Reggie's not married. He doesn't have any children of his own, but still the after effects, the impact of what Rorschach is and what it stands for is almost like this sort of virus that spreads throughout things. And even Reggie himself is having like these hallucinations. He's losing his mind. He's seeing like the eye of the monster in the forehead of Matthew Mason. This is the nature of things. And that's why this story can get a little bit confusing because it bounces back and forth between the past and the present. But again, this is designed to tell the story of how it was that Reggie Long met Adrian Veidt. And so in his effort to basically escape this mental institution, what he does is he incapacitates one of the guards when they show up with food or what have you, and then takes off to the roof of the building to try to get away. And in truth, it's really one of these things of like, I just want to get away from all this. Like, I want to be out of here. This is not where I belong. But when he gets up there, he basically ends up meeting Mothman. And Mothman's statement is like, I'm flying away. I'm getting out of this place. I don't need to be here. I'm perfectly sane. And he literally puts on like a moth suit, or really just kind of like wings, like makeshift wings made out of bed sheets really, and then just flies away into the moon, where Reggie's basically taken by the security guards and brought back to the institution itself. Now, shortly after this is where things get cool. Shortly after this, you end up having Mothman, who's essentially caught by the cops when he's just outside of like this diner, and then he's brought back to the asylum, and him and Reggie begin this sort of, not really a father-son relationship, but they begin like a friendly relationship. They start talking to each other all the time. Now for Byron Lewis, he was a really interesting concept in the Watchmen stories. I mean, he came from a life of privilege. Like, he never really struggled financially. And for him, like, being a superhero initially was more like, hey, let's just go have fun. It was more like an adventurous sort of thing. Now that began to change when he joined groups like the Minutemen, and then he stepped into the role of saying, well, let's actually do some good in the world, different things like that. The issue is that in the Watchmen comics, because the Age of Heroes wasn't met in the same way it was in like DC or Marvel, in the sense that like superheroes were effectively shunned. Not really superheroes, but people who dressed in costumes were really kind of shunned. Eventually what ended up happening is like when the whole superhero era came along, when the whole anti-mask era came along, and even during the height of McCarthyism, what you had was Byron, who basically succumbed to like alcoholism as a result of like all the dangers and perils that went into being a superhero. And so the result was that he was confined to a mental asylum in Maine, which seems to be where this whole thing is going on. But the idea here is that he was always an exceedingly smart guy. And for him, it was a matter of like putting the pieces together and looking around and seeing everything that was going on. And where he is a person that plays the role of a friend to Reggie, what he ends up doing is he actually manages to gather a whole bunch of Malcolm Long's belongings and bring them to Reggie. He basically gives his son his father's things. And so the result is that Reggie starts going through and looking at like the journal of Rorschach, looking at the notes of his father, listening to the recordings, all these things. And as time progresses, because of the fact that Reggie is in such a fractured, fragile mental state, what he ends up doing is actually adopting the persona and the personality of Rorschach. Now, again, this is cool because what Geoff Johns kind of teases here, and really what Alan Moore was sort of shooting for, was that anybody could be Rorschach. That was the point of the mask. Anybody could be behind that mask. But that's the basis behind this. That's why masked superheroes were perceived to be so dangerous, is because nobody knew who they were. You're a copy editor by day and like a vigilante by night, just smashing people's heads in and breaking their fingers and thumbs and hands. Like that's the whole thing that went behind that. And so for Reggie, like he kind of stands with this embodiment of Rorschach in the sense that at the end of the day, Walter Korvax was just a guy who had enough. In his mind, it was a matter of trying to find a way to curb the violence, so to speak. You know, being the killer who kills killers, if that makes any sense. And so with Reggie being in that state, being, basically like victimized by the various authorities who were there, the orderlies inside the insane asylum, being treated like crap, he just kind of tumbles down into this path of Rorschach, tumbles down into the role of Walter Korvax. Not only that, it's almost, I wouldn't go as far as to say it's a little bit of manipulation, but I would go as far as to say that when it comes to Mothman, it's intriguing because what he says is he starts going through and like, there's this puzzle they're working on, and the puzzle is ultimately the face of Ozymandias, and it's him basically saying, if you know how to look at this picture the right way, then you know what's going on. And that's what happened with Reggie. Reggie just started putting all the pieces together. He looked at the journal of Walter Korvax, everything that was going on, and said like, this is the fault of Adrian Veidt. It was always the fault of Adrian Veidt. Initially, he was kind of trying to figure things out and trying to work on things until he got to the end of the journal of Walter Korvax, when Walter Korvax basically says like, Adrian Veidt is the reason behind all this. And that's the funny thing, is because no one else has quite figured this out yet. And the newsreels, there's indications, there's people who are like speculating and saying, well, it seems like it's Adrian Veidt, and super, smart scientists and things like that, people who are trying to answer the question of what was going on, social psychologists and what have you, are analyzing like everything that was taking place and saying, well, all the clues seem to point to Adrian Veidt, but Reggie Long is the only person that has incontrovertible proof that Adrian Veidt was behind it all. And that's where he full on steps into the role of Rorschach. Because now what he does is he looks around and says, there's a guy out there that killed 3 million people. What would Rorschach have done? What would Walter Korvax have done? Well, Walter Korvax would have killed him. That's what Walter Korvax believed needed to be done, that Adrian Veidt had to be stopped. So I'm going to pick up the slack. I'm going to continue on this mission of Walter Korvax. I'm going to kill Adrian Veidt. And at this point, it just breaks down to the question of how can it be done? How can it be pulled off? And this is when people begin to start realizing that Adrian Veidt's the one behind all this. That's when it really began to go topsy-turvy. Because remember, when it came to like the time gap between the Watchmen comics and the Doomsday Clock comics, we don't have anything to fill in that gap. All we have is what's been told to us by Geoff Johns and like what interviews have been done and what speculation exists on the internet. But by and large, this answers that question. It tells us that like at the end of Watchmen, the world was united in response to like this giant monster that killed 3 million people in New York. The world was united in mourning, and the world looked to make the world a better place because people began to realize how fragile they were. And then the information came out that Adrian Veidt was behind it all, and then that fragility shattered, and the world was worse off than it was before Veidt went through this whole scheme of unleashing this monster in New York. Because people realized they'd been tricked, they'd been duped. It wasn't an actual piece. And so in light of all this, what Reggie does is he actually sets a fire inside the institution, and where he and Mothman are going to leave and go find Adrian, instead, Mothman goes back into the building and simply just allows himself to die. And so then you have Reggie, who just takes on the whole Rorschach mantle and goes to find Adrian Veidt, who's basically on the Percy Bysshe, this tanker out in the middle of nowhere. But when he gets there, it's intriguing. And this is where we start to get like the Reggie personality and the Rorschach personality who are a little in conflict. When Reggie shows up to kill Adrian Veidt just kind of turns around and says, look, you can kill me if you want to, but like I'm dying anyway. Like it's only a matter of time before I die. Like there's nothing that can be done. I've basically got brain cancer. And it's kind of cool here because in truth, like if Adrian Veidt were going to die anyway, of what purpose would be served by Rorschach killing him? That's kind of the stance that Reggie takes. Rorschach kills people who would otherwise be able to continue on their normal lives, just doing whatever it is that they want to do all the time. But for Adrian Veidt, he's not really a criminal. He's not really a bad guy. And that's the reason why this whole situation works. That's the reason why this is so cool. One of the classic examples in a situation like this is the trolley train, right? Like you're a trolley conductor and the brakes go out. The brakes go out and all you have at your control is like the steering column. And you can steer the trolley on one of two sets of tracks. On one set of tracks is one construction worker and he's totally oblivious, has no idea this trolley train is just hurtling towards him, is going to smash into him and kill him entirely. But if you steer it to the other tracks, there's 5 construction workers. You have to choose between one or the other. Which one do you choose? Well, you choose the one construction worker. You kill that one guy in order to save those 5 guys. It's utilitarianism. And when you're Adrian Veidt and you're looking around and you say humanity, there's 7 some odd billion people or 6 or 5 or whatever the absolute number count was at the time the story was written. When you have however many billions of people in the world who are all going to be destroyed because the clock is inching ever closer to nuclear war between the US and the USSR, then like what steps do you take to unite people? People don't unite willingly anymore. It doesn't work that way. People have to be united when there's like a massive catastrophe. What he needed was a catalyst. He needed something that would force humanity to unite because they had to, not because they wanted to. And so that's what that monster was. The monster showed up in the city of New York. It killed 3 million some odd people. And it was like, oh my God, the terrible situation. This is so awful, and the humanity and so on and so forth. But in light of how terrible things were and the massive amount of casualties, humanity united. And that was the goal of Adrian Veidt. What he didn't pay attention to and what he didn't think about was the aftermath. And that's the cool thing here, is because this goes into that whole moral philosophy. Like what makes an act good? Is it, the consequence, or is it the act itself? Is it the intention behind the act? If Adrian Veidt's intention was to unite humanity and make the world a better place, he's a good guy. If all you care about is the consequence, the world's worse off after what he did than it was before he did what he did, then he's a bad guy. He made things terrible. But that's the difference here. Adrian Veidt wasn't looking to rob people. He wasn't looking to unleash a monster in New York and then steal everybody's valuables while they were all distracted. He was trying to make the world a legitimate, better place. And so because of that, you kind of have to have pity on him. And that's where he sort of began to give up. That's where he looked around and said, if humanity really wanted to unite, it would have. If people really wanted to solve the world's problems, then they would have. But they don't want to solve the world's problems. They want to goose step themselves into nuclear war between the US and the USSR. There's nothing that can be done. Whatever happens, happens. And that's why he teamed up with Reggie Long. And that's why he said, we have to go find Dr. Manhattan. We have to bring him back. What will happen when they do? We don't know. Manhattan might show up and say, well, humanity is going to kill itself anyway, so I'll just help them along a little bit and just wipe away the world. There's any number of things that could go on in like the whole Watchmen universe. And so because of that, what we end up doing is with the two of them teaming up, and that of course is where Doomsday Clock #1 picks up, we jump back to the modern day here in issue #4 after Reggie had been thrown into Arkham Asylum by Bruce Wayne. And so what ends up happening here is basically he has a conversation with what appears to be Saturn Girl from the Legion of Superheroes, because she's been locked up in Arkham Asylum the entire time. That's where she's been this whole time. That was teased back in DC Universe Rebirth #1. And so what she says is we have to get out of here. We have to make our escape. She's already out. She's literally out of her cell and just roaming around. And she's like, we have to get out of here, because I don't have that much time. And whatever's coming is going to require the entire superhero community. If we don't work together, we're all going to die. And that's what's cool, because it's basically saying Dr. Manhattan is coming here. It's only a matter of time before he does. And so the two of them basically team up, and who knows what happens at, we'll have to find out in the next issue. But what we also end up finding out, and this is the cool indication here, what seems to have happened is that Dr. Matthew Mason was a fictional person. He didn't exist. Instead, it looks like it was Alfred Pennyworth, although I still think it's Batman, but it looks like it was Alfred Pennyworth who was disguised as Matthew Mason, who went walking into the insane asylum, pretending to be a psychologist, trying to understand who Rorschach is. And that makes sense. Batman's not going to take that person, throw him into Arkham Asylum, and then just throw away the key and never ever ask any questions. Batman doesn't work like that. It's always the significance of gathering information, finding out as much as he can, as often as he can. And that's exactly what's been going on here. They've basically been investigating Reggie Long without him knowing it. And so that's where the question becomes, will Batman side with Reggie, or will Batman stand against Reggie? But with that being said, guys, we're going to bring this video to an end. If you are new here to Comics Explained, make sure you guys hit the sub button to become part of the Rob Corps. If you guys enjoyed this video, make sure you drop a like, and I will catch you all later. Peace.